Hey, everybody. This is Carlos. I am the CEO at Product School. And today I'm here with Basel Fakuri, who's the CEO at User Interviews. Welcome to the show, Basel.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
User Interviews. This company has been around for around 10 years at this point. And I was doing some research on you and your product, because a lot of product people use it. So it seems and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like you guys raised a total of $45 million to date.
Yeah, exactly. We just we raised our Series B about 2 years ago, and over the history of the company, just around $45 million.
So exactly. And then some of your clients include Amazon, Spotify, Adobe, and you have a network of over 2.4 million research participants.
Yeah, those are some of our clients. We also work with a lot of clients outside of tech, so financial institutions, CPGs, retail, um, and that number is out of date. We're actually up to 5 million participants in our audience, so we've been growing it every month.
We need to give feedback to Perplexity.
Yeah,
Yes,
I'll let them know.
So I'm hoping we can have a deep dive into user research, specifically how product teams can better leverage research here. So maybe we can start with your own thoughts on what is user research.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a spectrum of user research from how rigorous it is, and obviously I think the more trained, the better people are at research, the research and outcomes are better. But at the end of the day, the other side of the spectrum is really just talking to your customers, right? And I think really everyone is trying to understand their customers better. I think that's a very non-controversial statement, right? Every company is trying to understand their customers better, and talking to people, customers or not, helps you understand them better, right? So user research is really just a way to better understand your users, to get those qualitative insights that you can't get in any other way.
So as you think about user research and all the different methods, right? For someone who's, let's say, a product manager whose full-time job is not just to talk to customers, like
Mhm.
how do you think about that? Like how much time is it? What's the best practice in terms of time that should be allocated for user research?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it depends on the context, right? So I think, um, first of all, like if you are building purely, back end, less customer facing, you'll probably want to do less research, right? Whereas if you're building something in the UX, in the UI, that might need more research, right? And I think also it depends who your team is, right? So obviously the product school, we're mainly talking to product managers here. If you have full-time researchers doing research, if you have designers doing research, it might be okay for you to do less research. If you, like many product managers, don't have a researcher on your team, then you should be doing more of that research, right? So I think, like everything, I think it depends on the context, and then it also depends where you are in the product cycle. So I think if you are just coming up with an idea for a completely new product, you're functioning the same as a founder, right? And I think in those early days, you should be talking to customers and potential customers as much as possible. You should be doing a lot of this really meaty generative research. At the beginning, I think as you're building the product, you might switch more into prototype testing or usability testing. And then once the product's live, you kind of want to have that constant feedback from existing customers to understand what can you add, what's not going well. So
I,
a
I,
lot of
I
it
think
depends on context.
I think that's a good point as we dive into like the different methods, right? You mentioned like
Mhm.
usability testing or
Mhm.
prototyping testing versus like maybe user interviews, maybe surveys. Like, what are some of those more common tools at product teams' disposal that you think can be like the go-to?
Yeah. And I realize I gave, the classic roundabout context matters answer, but I think let me go back to the last one and give maybe a rule of thumb. I think it's very reasonable for PMs to be doing research on a steady cadence. And that can be, every Friday you have a couple interviews set up on your schedule, because you almost always have questions that could be better answered. So I think a weekly cadence or biweekly cadence, I think, is very reasonable for any PM who thinks of themselves as user centric, to kind of set up for themselves. But yeah, so the second question is just like, what are some of the methodologies? Is that the
Yeah,
other?
so if someone is going to block time per week to do research, to talk to customers, like specifically, what are some of those methods that you recommend? So this is a productive use of their
Mhm.
time?
Yeah. Once again, I think it depends where you are in the product cycle. So the earlier you are, you might want to do more generative research. So this can be interviews, right, where you're saying, hey, what is the current pain point? Validating it as a current pain point. How are you solving this now? What is out in the market? And those can just be basic interviews, right? I think as the product is more developed, you might want to focus on other things. So usability, right? So usability tests to make sure, hey, we built this flow with this intention. Does that map to your mental model? Is this intuitive to you? So, I would think the real basic split is kind of generative versus evaluative in a lot of ways. And I think it depends where you are in the product lifecycle.
One of the concepts that I always struggle with, and this is more of my hot take, I always think of product market fit as something that is evolving, right? I think more startups are always in the chase of product market fit. And then once they assume they are post market product market fit, they just turn the gears into something else.
Yeah.
And I've seen the market evolve so much where you are kind of constantly chasing for that next frontier in terms of product market fit. So one of the misconceptions I guess I've seen product teams do is that they would spend a lot of time doing research when they are thinking about building something.
Mhm.
Once they kind of get to what they want to build and start building it, they stop doing that type of discovery. And then when they have another new idea, they do more discovery. So I wonder, like, how can this be more integrated as part of a recurring ritual versus a one-off push?
Yeah, I think, the way I think about that is defaults, right? You want to make the default that you're talking to customers. So I think things like blocking off a time on a recurring basis for doing research, then that makes it the default. Every Thursday I'm going to spend, an hour, 2 hours talking to customers or potential customers. Having the tool set, right? So, obviously at user interviews, we make it very easy to find those participants. So the more you use us, you can go back, talk to the participants we've already found for you, remove that friction. If you're using a testing tool, you can have kind of the test set up. So the more you kind of have the default in your schedule and in your cadence that this is something we do as part of the cycle, as opposed to something where it's, hey, when we think about it, we go and do it. I think the better. And I agree with you. I think um, the benefits of research do not decrease as the product is live and out there, right? Like you're constantly building and investing in the product, and you're building and investing based off trying to create user value and understanding that value. The way to understand that what that value is through research.
One of the things that I'm observing in the market also is that product managers are becoming way more involved in the research piece for different reasons. One is teams are getting smaller and scrappier, but also it's not always clear what's the value that a researcher brings to the table. Like they do a lot of research, but then the connection to business sometimes is missing. And I think PMs do an excellent job at bridging that gap. So as you think about the future, also with AI and like some of these jobs being more automated, like where is that balance between, let's say, a team having researchers doing research full time versus product managers owning that piece for the most part?
Yeah, I think kind of what we've seen, kind of the narrative I've seen is when we first started this business, actually, like teams having researchers was relatively rare, right? Like there was a lot of outsourcing of research to agencies. I think teams started hiring individual researchers, at a faster cadence. I remember there was a lot of content about being the first researcher in your company, like how to show the value. They then started being like larger research teams. I think functionally what happened is the internal demand for that research increased faster than they can build out those teams. And I think that's one thing that happens with research is the more you do it, the more you want to do it, right? There's kind of this slow start, but you start seeing the value. You start getting over the awkwardness of doing research. So the more you do it, you'll continue to do it more. So as people started asking for more research, and the research teams just weren't funded enough, then we saw more research being happen through PMs and designers through this big push towards democratization, right? I think this kind of democratization of research probably peaked, I don't know, 4 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago at the time then, or maybe 3 or 4 years ago. And then at that time, what what happened was there were some issues that came up with that, just the quality of the research, the participant experience, the friction for the product, the PMs doing research. They then started becoming like larger research operations teams. I think that's kind of where we were, and during that split, what we saw a lot of was research operations really building the tools and processes and making sure everyone was doing this compliant, easy way. Researchers doing more generative research, strategic researcher, and then PMs and designers doing more kind of evaluative research. We saw a lot of that happen. When the market started crashing, kind of end of 2022, especially in tech world, we did see a pullback, I think, across the broader product org, and that hit research, I think. And I don't know if it hit research more than product proportionally. I haven't actually seen data. I think anecdotally people feel that way, and part of that reason might just be there were less researchers, right? So if you have if you only have two researchers, if you fire one, you've automatically kind of laid off 50% of your research team, right? Because you only have intervals of one. But I think for that premise, though, I do think that if you look over any larger time frame, research has been growing incredibly quickly, right? And I think this is a step backwards, but research has been growing incredibly quickly. And I think um, at the same time, we have been seeing PMs and designers doing research significantly more, right? So I think we're seeing just like the function of research increase significantly over the past few years, even if there's like a step back as the market took a downturn.
Yeah, and in terms of the org design, like
Mhm.
where do you see that fit? Because I've seen obviously a lot of product squads or pods. They call it sometimes
Mhm.
PDE, right? Product design engineering. They tend
Yeah,
to have they seem to have to be together.
yeah.
Um, Data research is more of adjacent. It's kind of unclear to me, like if they are part of that squad, permanent squad, or they are playing more of a cross-functional support role for multiple. Like, how do you see the research role play out within an org?
Yeah, I think generally what we see is it's like part of the product or design org at some ratio to so that you might have, call it 5 engineers to a PM and then, a couple PMs to a researcher, right? Or 5 engineers to a PM and designer, and then, one researcher for a couple PMs and designers. Um, and I think that's probably like the standard way it's set up. Um, I believe that we are going to see more teams kind of have insights teams in a lot of ways, and these insights teams will have both data and research because I think research and data are doing very similar things, right? They're answering questions and they're just using different methodologies. So I think over time we will see more insights teams, and I think these insights teams will be horizontal across orgs, right? Like working with product and marketing and sale, because I think you want to be speaking the same language across the organization. Um, that being said, I haven't seen many companies do that, so that's more of a prediction I expect to happen more than there's been a ton of data of companies moving that direction. What do you think?
I'm in the same boat, right? Like that's why I wanted to see your point of view here. It's like there is definitely research teams and data
Mhm.
teams. They are not always together.
But
They are
usually,
not. They're one of the challenges that I see with that is who calls the shot, right? Like if you have someone doing research over here, qualitative one, someone over there doing quantitative research, they come up with some insights. Then what? Like who is the tiebreaker? How do you ensure that those learnings are converted into action?
yeah. I haven't. I don't. I don't know. I think there's a tension. I think it's. I don't know necessarily if it's about like we're seeing one thing, you're seeing another thing. Which one do we follow? I think at good companies, everyone's kind of like focusing on finding the truth. I think they're just very different skill sets, and it's very hard to find a leader of a department who can be a leader for research and a leader for analytics and data, right? Like most usually you don't have like a leader who has both of those experiences and skill sets. So I think more than like the tension on who calls the shot, I feel like there's just like where do you find a leader who can kind of lead both of those departments, right? Because they are different skill sets in a lot of
And
ways.
to me, even if they are both saying the same, like user research or data analytics, my challenge with like who calls the shot is okay. Ultimately, I need a business person, regardless of the title, that
Yeah.
is going to say, "Cool, this is true for the
Mhm.
most part. Now we're going to do something about it." Because
Yeah.
sometimes I see a disconnect between great insights and then lack of action because it's unclear like who is supposed to implement that into the product.
Yeah. And I think that's, often where like PMs fill that gap, right? And I think the other thing is not like, okay, we have the insight, how do we implement it? It's what is the cost to implement it? What is the trade-offs? What are we how are we rank ordering these, right? Like it's you don't I think as a research team, you don't want to be a team that's just purely kind of adding to the list of things to do, right? You want to help prioritize and show that, hey, this the ROI of what we do this, right? You want to It's very easy to make a list of features that would be nice to build or problems customers have. I think it's a lot harder to rank those problems and try to figure out the impact from them and help do that trade-off. And I think that's, often a skill set that, skilled PMs have.
Yeah, and I also want to talk about the market landscape. Obviously,
Mm.
this space is crowded, right? There's a lot of different players. So how do you position yourself?
Yeah. So, the way I see the research landscape is you have different methodologies, right? So everything from an interview to usability test to a survey to a diary study, et cetera. I tend to think of those as kind of vertical columns. And then you have what I call like the testing tool at the top, which is the tool you use to actually conduct the research, right? So user testing is probably the biggest one, and except for the survey companies like Qualtrics or SurveyMonkey. But then you also have a lot of kind of mid-size or smaller companies like Maze or Lookback or Optimal Workshop. So there's really a lot of companies kind of that I think are doing at the testing tool layer. Um, the layer underneath is the participants, which is where we play a user interview. So I think participants is split between external participants and internal participants. So we have a product called Recruit for external participants, which is an audience of 5 million people, and then a set of automations that gets the right person in the right study. So we can find you participants for research studies differentiated because we can find niche participants, we can find them fast, we can find them with a very low fraud rate. And then we have a product called Research Hub, which is when you're doing research with your own customer base. We handle all the workflow, the logistics around reaching out to them, scheduling them, paying them. Then on the back end, we basically built a CRM for the research team, right? So a place for you to upload your own customers, track who's been in what study, segment them, build out guardrails to say how often we can reach out to them. So between those two products, we think we're very horizontal in the participant layer, and we can play nicely with all of those testing tools. So we find the participants, then you send them to whatever tool you want to. I think there's also a third layer of kind of the insight repositories, like the Dovetails or Hey Marvins as well. So that's kind of how I see it. I think most of the competition's on that testing tool layer, and we've tried to not go there and instead be very complementary to a lot of those tools.
Got it. So you can partner with those testing tools and feed them participants.
Exactly. And we have a number of integrations with a lot of those tools as well. So, the way I see it is you need your users, you need a tool to do research with, and then you need a place to store your insights. And that's kind of how the stack lays out. Um, I think the newest thing we're seeing in the space are the AI moderated tools. So there's tools like Outset and Listen Labs and Heard by Ellis. There's a number of these, and what they are doing is actually having an AI moderator do the research with you. And because it's not a person, they're able to talk to many more people, right? So I think their taglines are often we want to have the breadth of a survey, but the depth of an interview. So that's kind of the newest entrance in the research space. And we
I
also
wanted
think of them as very complementary.
I wanted to talk with you about AI because that's the first thing that comes to mind, right? As technically now it's possible to automate research or gather even synthetic data from people who are not humans. Like, how does that impact your business?
Yeah. I think holistically, I think that technological change increases the need for research, right? Because the behaviors and the interfaces are changing at a faster rate. So therefore, you should do more research because you need to react and respond to this change. There's more unknowns, right? You can't just build on the same frameworks that you used previously. So I think AI and any technological change should be bullish for research in a very like holistic, broad sense. Just pausing there. I guess do you believe that?
So on that front, yes. I mean, personally, I use the deep research
Okay.
feature on ChatGPT, on Perplexity, and now Grok 3. Like, I see how people can now play the research role without really being
Yeah.
professionals in that field. But the other angle, and I think this is more particular to your business, right? If part of your value proposition is the people that you provide, the humans that are being interviewed by your clients. And now we're saying that more people can gather insights without interviewing humans. Like,
Mhm.
how are you thinking about that so you can continue kind of being a relevant player in the new future?
Yeah, so I think you have secondary research and primary research. I think AI is going to have a very big effect on secondary research, right? Like if you think about internally in a company, if you want to go understand what participants have said, or sorry, not what your users have said to you previously, it's very easy to kind of summarize, sort through, curate all of those insights. If you want to go see what's happened outside in the world, it's easy to go do that research with things like deep research, right? Um, I don't think AI replaces the doing research with a user of your tool or a potential user of your tool. Because quite frankly, I don't think what you're trying to gain from them is in most of the training data for these LLMs, right? So there's not a lot of training data on, hey, go through this specific workflow we just built. What is that? How do you respond to that, right? There's um, not a lot of training data on, hey, like, give me feedback on this feature we built. Which APIs would you want us to integrate with, right? Like, when you're thinking about a specific product, that I don't think the LLMs that exist today are very useful for replacing that sort of user research. And I think that's kind of what we've seen in the market, right? There are people who have tried kind of synthetic data, and I think from my interactions with the broader research market, I haven't seen a lot of people like super bullish on that, right? I could be wrong, and those might change, but I think at the end of the day, like when you're doing user research, you're trying to understand how they interact with you, how they interact with the world that you probably can't find by just searching the internet
Mhm.
functionally.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, there is width and there is depth, and I think narrowing down on the one-on-one experience with a human to test something very specific gives
Mhm,
you something complementary to what you can kind of gather by
mhm,
using automatic tools. There's another angle here, when I think about research, I think about kind of reactive. It's a reactive approach. Like, I want to learn something, I'm going to schedule a session with someone, and I'm going to ask them questions. But
mhm.
there's also a proactive approach here. I'm thinking about session replay tools, heat mapping tools, even other type of data analytic tools that are constantly gathering
Yeah.
activity from what the user is doing, and then driving patterns to say, hey,
Mhm.
it seems like you have an opportunity here.
Yeah.
So how does that kind of apply to the type of research that you provide?
Yeah, I think definitely. Um, I think that's always been valuable, right? Like, I think this concept of I think we historically, internally, I don't know if this is kind of what people say outside of user interviews, but we've kind of broken it up into like active insights versus passive insights, right? And an active insight is something where you go and send out a survey, you go and do a research study, right? Like, you're actively just doing something to get this insight. A passive insight might be something that someone tells your support team, someone tells your sales team. You can tell through the data, right? Think more voice of the customer type of things, right? And I think those can answer similar questions, right? There's times when you choose one versus the other. I do think there's a world where AI makes it easier to get data out of those passive insights, right? And easier to get more data out of those passive insights. And if you think of those passive and active insights as somewhat as substitutes, and you imagine that it becomes easier to get data out of the passive insights, you could imagine that, you know, using the passive insights is getting a larger percent of the pie, right? I think that's a reasonable belief that would have where you might proportionally be getting more data from or more qualitative insights from what people tell you passively versus going and doing the research sessions. That being said, I think the overall change, and also there's going to be a lot of things that decrease the friction of doing active research. I think the pie should be getting bigger, even if some of the percentages are shifting. Did that make sense?
Um,
I feel like I used some kind of specific terms.
we were using different terms, right? I was using the term active or proactive versus reactive, and,
Yeah,
and you were using different one. But ultimately, that is what we're talking about. Like,
yeah,
I'm you trying to you apply business terms, right? My biggest frustration sometimes, and I think I mentioned this before with insights teams, is making sure that they are being surfaced to
mhm,
a real decision maker,
mhm,
regardless of their title, and that person is going to then do something with it. The decision could be we're doing nothing because
mhm,
it's too expensive or there are other priorities, but ultimately, this work that a lot of people have put in is not going to waste.
Mhm. Yeah, I agree. I think one thing we've been thinking about, how can we help our customers, is like, how can we help them champion them internally, right? How can we help them kind of do internal marketing for the work they've been doing, like, right, with the rest of their company? How can we help them show the ROI, right? How can we help them win an insight? So you talked about surfacing the insight. There's also the time where, do they get credit that an insight they surfaced was actually used, right? Is research as a function being credited with the effect it is having on the product, right? And I think like all of that is under this bucket of like, when you're in a big enterprise, there's a level of marketing yourself. And I think research is a function potentially, there's still room to kind of help researchers do that internally. And obviously, as you market yourself better, then people will use more insights, right? It should be like a nice flywheel. If you can show the benefit of the insights, they'll use the insights the next time.
Exactly. You especially you can then show what happened, and then even if it wasn't good, there was
Yeah.
some action, and then we're doing something else. Ultimately, what we do in product, we call it just building a culture of experimentation,
Yeah.
and just making that a habit for people, and kind of like empower people to come up with ideas, to identify reasons why something should or should not work, and also feel more comfortable pushing back on
Yeah.
the CEO or the ultimate decision maker for that initiative, in a way that is not about the person, but about the experiment. And ultimately, it give people the option to then run a quick test. So kind of de-risk the decision by just making it easy to try.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%. I think like, I think the culture that you want to build in an organization is not I am right, or, I found this, you found it, but like we are trying to find the truth, right? We are trying to find what is right. It doesn't matter who surfaced it or who found it, but like I think having the data to show that yes, like this methodology helps us find that truth, I think can be really valuable. And therefore, like we should let people go out and try to find that truth regardless of who it is.
Let's role play this. How do you drink your own champagne and use this type of research for your own business?
Yeah, I mean, we do research a lot, right? Like I think we tend to attract, as you would expect, right, the company's cold user interviews. So I think our research is very meta, right? Like we're doing user research with user research about a user research tool. And I think we have some benefits, right? Like, so one is, the PMs and designers that we hire, like, obviously believe in user research. So therefore, they want to do more research. They will go and do more research. We'll dog food our own product, right? Like we'll use our product for that. The second benefit we have is, I think our clients or potential clients, like they get kind of excited to be on the other side of the table. Like their whole life they're doing the research, and then now it's like, oh, I get to be a participant, right? So I think it's like kind of fun for them. So like we get like people are open to kind of doing the research with us. So I think we have a lot of benefits that allow us to be more kind of research driven. I think the other thing is, um, I think actually, sorry, maybe more of a tangent. I think it's actually kind of funny when you do that research, because I remember I'm not trained as a researcher, right? So when I first started the company, I remember I was doing some of this research, and I went to someone's office. It was an in-person study, and she was like, "Okay, your script is all messed up." And she like came around the table and was like, "This is a leading question. Like, cross this one out," and basically rewrote my whole script. She's like, "All right, let's start over and do the research again." So, I think it's kind of in a lot of ways easier and more fun for us, and therefore we do a lot of it.
I want to wrap up this interview with one of your hot takes. I heard you say that sometimes you should just build a feature a customer asks for. So when are those cases where you actually do not need to do research?
Yeah, I mean, a customer asking for it is a form of research, right? They're just kind of skipping you asking the questions in a lot of ways. But look, I think there's always a balance when building product around um, what uh, what is the vision that you're building for, what is broadly applicable, what do individual companies ask for. And I think uh, I think sometimes kind of building something for a couple big clients is kind of not idealistic, right? It's kind of the opposite of the ideal way to build a product, and a lot of what people say. But I think sometimes from a business perspective, if it's something that a few customers that are big are asking for, if it's already on your roadmap but just far away, it's like I think sometimes you have to play on the field that you're at, and you can't always like live in the ideal. So you just build it and then go on to the next thing.
I 100% agree with that. I think there's a reality of situation, and sometimes, as a leader, you have to make certain trade-offs.
Yeah, exactly. So
But Basil, thank you so much for your time going deep with us on things related to user research. I learned a lot.
awesome. Yeah, this was a lot of fun. Happy to chat anytime.